As we move now from theory into its application to the particular challenges represented by terrorism, uh, this presentation is inspired by two things with which you are already somewhat familiar. The first is just peacemaking theory, with its insistence that all human beings, and particularly all Christians, have an obligation to be seekers after justice and peace, and its focus on the policies and practices that reduce conflict such that war is less likely to break out. It is also inspired by the document produced by the United States Catholic Bishops' Conference in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, that document called Living with Faith and Hope. Roman Catholics, of course, generally work within a just war framework, and that document reflects that framework and says that a military response to the 9/11 attacks, or a limited military response at least, is surely justified. At the same time, that document indicates that a military response alone has no reasonable chance of success. That is to say, it has no chance of truly making us safe from terrorism. It points to a responsibility and to the significance of looking for the root causes of terrorism, suggesting that we simply can't kill all the terrorists. We must rather focus on drying up the soil that seems to produce a ready number of recruits for terrorist organizations. Interestingly, these documents suggest, I think, that there's a role for all human beings, for all of us, in the struggle against terrorism. Certainly, there is an appropriate role for those committed to just war theory and a belief that participation in war is morally appropriate. But there is also a role for those just peacemakers and those pacifists who are committed to policies and practices that make peace more likely. All of us have a role. The only group that seems not to be understood as having a role from the perspective of just peacemaking theory and living with faith and hope are crusaders, who would seem, from that perspective, to only make matters worse. In this presentation, I'll be looking at what I call three paradigms for understanding the root causes of terrorism. Three ways of understanding the ultimate sources of the conflict between those folks inspired by Islam who are engaging in terrorism against the United States and its allies in the West. With respect to each of these paradigms, I'll be asking what do these suggest about the possible peacemaking practices in which we might engage such that we can successfully make ourselves more secure from terrorism. I will be asking about how each of these paradigms nourishes a particular kind of Christian response to terrorism and Christian participation in the struggle against terrorism. The three paradigms we'll be looking at are each associated with a particular scholar in the area of international affairs or political science. They are the clash of civilizations, associated with Samuel Huntington, jihad versus McWorld, associated with Benjamin Barber, and the United States as empire, a perspective articulated well by Andrew Bacevich. You could understand what we are doing as we look at these paradigms as drawing upon one of the four sources, a particular one of the four sources that nourish Christian ethical reflection: reason. When I talked about reason, I said that Christian discernment is often nourished by the very best human thinking, whatever its source, from the various sciences and social sciences. Here we see the way in which serious thinkers in the area of political science are nourishing Christian ethical reflection. first paradigm that has had great influence is called the clash of civilizations. It is a product of Samuel Huntington, who, as you can see here, was a bit of a child prodigy before he became a professor in the Department of Government at Harvard University throughout his entire career until his death a few years ago. Huntington's fundamental claim in the article and the book, The Clash of Civilization, is that international conflict in the post-Cold War world will follow cultural or civilizational lines. Here's what he wrote. The great divisions among humankind and the dominating source of conflict in the post-Cold War world will be cultural. Nation-states will remain the most powerful actors in world affairs, but the principal conflicts of global politics will occur between nations and groups from different civilizations. The clash of civilizations will draw the battle lines of future conflicts. You can see here the 8 world cultures or civilizations that Huntington has identified in his work. Now, the obvious question to ask is why, according to Huntington, should we be experiencing a clash of civilizations? I think his views can be broken down into 4 distinct points. First, Huntington believes that civilizational or cultural differences are grounded in distinctive religious commitments or distinctive religious traditions. This is interesting because most of the time in the West, we tend to think that religion is relatively insignificant publicly or politically. We have largely privatized religion, seeing it as a personal matter, and we've separated church and state. So we think religion is largely irrelevant politically. Huntington says otherwise in his claim about the conflict or the clash among civilizations. Secondly, Huntington insists that these different cultures or different civilizations give us fundamentally different personal and political worldviews and commitments. We tend to see basic things that are significant to us in profoundly different ways because we are shaped by different cultures. He says that these cultural differences or civilizational differences are nothing that have come lately. Rather, these cultures have evolved over centuries. Our beliefs about the fundamental matters that we referred to are rooted in ancient cultural traditions. And those cultural traditions profoundly shape our identities. And our identities are not something that we can easily change. We are who we are because of the ways in which we as individuals are rooted in particular and distinctive and different cultural or civilizational traditions. Let's look at a couple of quotations from Huntington that make these points. He writes, civilizations are differentiated from each other by history, language, culture, tradition, and most important, religion. The people of different civilizations have different views on the relations between God and man, the individual and the group, the citizen and the state, parents and children, husband and wife, as well as differing views of the relative importance of rights and responsibilities, liberty and authority, equality and hierarchy. These differences are the product of centuries. They will not soon disappear. They are more fundamental than differences among political ideologies and political regimes. Or consider this quotation. Cultural characteristics and differences are less mutable and hence less easily compromised and resolved than political and economic ones. In the former Soviet Union, communists can become Democrats. The rich can become poor and the poor rich. But Russians cannot become Estonians and Azeris cannot become Armenians. In other words, those civilizational or cultural identities are more permanent, more constant, more irresolvable than economic or political or ideological disagreement. He continues, in class and ideological conflicts, the key question was, which side are you on? And people could and did choose sides and change sides. In conflicts between civilizations, the question is, what are you? That's a given that cannot be changed. And as we know from Bosnia to the Caucasus to the Sudan, the wrong answer to that question can mean a bullet in the head. Even more than ethnicity, religion discriminates sharply and exclusively among people. A person can be half French and half Arab, and simultaneously even a citizen of two countries. It's more difficult to be half Catholic and half Muslim. Now, the first question maybe to ask ourselves about Huntington's perspective is why the clash of civilizations now, at this particular point in our history? You would think, based on what he has just said, that civilizational conflict would have always been the primary driver in international conflict, but that's not been the case. His first answer is that civilizational or cultural conflict had largely been kept in check in the post-World War II era by the ideological conflict between the two great empires, the communist bloc and the democratic or Western bloc. But now that conflict has disappeared. And so those forces that controlled cultural conflict and aligned them in terms of the conflict between communism and democracy, those have disappeared. Second reason he says that we are experiencing civilizational or cultural conflict now is, quote, the world is becoming a smaller place, unquote. Or put differently, there is more and more cross-cultural interaction in this increasingly globalized world. This is an interesting claim because we generally believe, or like to believe, that the more contact we have with folks from other cultures or civilizations, the greater our understanding, the greater our recognition that despite the differences, behind it all, we are all human beings. Huntington insists otherwise. Rather, it's the fact that the world has become smaller, that we have more cross-cultural contact. It's that itself which is producing conflict. I like to think of it this way. When I was young, when I was a child, my main knowledge or experience of people in other cultures was through the National Geographic magazine, for example. And so people from different cultures than my own appeared beautiful, exotic, exciting, interesting. Now, Huntington is suggesting, as a result of globalization, as a result of the shrinking of the world, those folk that used to be known to me only in the pages of a magazine are living down the street. I run into them when I go into McDonald's. They're building their houses of worship around the corner from my own. And his argument is, or his perspective is, that greater contact is producing not greater understanding, but more conflict. Third, we are experiencing cultural conflict now because the processes of economic modernization and social change associated with globalization throughout the world are separating people from their long-standing local identities. Those processes of economic modernization are actually spreading Western culture. And what people are experiencing as Western culture moves into their world is that it tends to separate them from or alienate them from their own ancient cultural identities. Then, Huntington insists, what's happening is that religion is moving in to take a greater role. It's being revitalized in people's lives precisely as a mechanism for resisting the culturally corrosive encroachment of Western forms of life, Western worldviews, and Western beliefs into these more traditional local cultures. Based on this analysis, Huntington, back in the early and mid-90s, predicted the following. First, he said civilizational or cultural and international conflict in the near-term future will primarily be what he called the West against the rest. Now, he did not mean by that the non-Western cultures would form a coalition against the West, but rather that the conflict across civilizational lines would be largely from one of the world cultures, Japanese culture, let's say, against the West, or Chinese or Confucian culture against the West, or African culture against the West. While he was not focused particularly on conflict between the Islamic world and the Western world, he did say this: the centuries-long conflict or tension between those two cultures or civilizations is unlikely to decline. That, of course, now appears to be a gross understatement. So what are the implications for understanding 9/11 or for understanding terrorism in general from the perspective of Huntington's idea of civilizational or cultural conflict? First thing to be said, obviously, is that from this perspective, the 9/11 attacks can be seen as an aspect of a fundamental clash between Islamic and Western civilizations. Now, Huntington, I think, would be clear in also suggesting that the attacks cannot be understood apart from what has been the reality over the last several centuries of Western ascendancy or Western cultures moving into a situation of global dominance, and the decline of the global significance of Islam. Now, he also suggests that Western ascendancy and Islamic decline are rooted in cultural differences. Now, we might say that Western culture supports a worldview and values and practices that are more likely to lead to global dominance. But it also suggests something suggests the superiority of Western culture in comparison to Islamic culture. Fourth, an implication here is that since the sources of terrorism understood from this perspective are cultural rather than political, there's very little we can do to address the root causes of terrorism. Those who use the clash of civilizations paradigm to structure their understanding of the situation will often say they hate us for who we are, not because of anything we've done or are doing. If that's true, there's nothing we can do to change that would undermine or reduce their hatred. They hate us because of who they are, and it's distinctly different from who we are. And finally, this paradigm seems to interpret Islam as the source of Islamic terrorism. That it is not necessarily a perversion of Islam that produces terrorism, but Islam itself. So Huntington has written this: the underlying problem for the West is not Islamic fundamentalism, it is Islam, a different civilization whose people are convinced of the superiority of their culture and are obsessed with the inferiority of their power. What then can we say about Christian appropriations of the clash of civilization paradigm, or how those who draw upon it have their own Christian discernment shaped? The first thing to be said, I think, is this: Huntington's paradigm reinforces a tendency among Christians to identify Western values with Christian values, and therefore to believe that Christians have a deep stake in defending whatever is under attack by terrorists. So over and above the question of the appropriateness of the means of those attacks, terrorism, is the question of what's under attack, and do we have a stake in defending it. Huntington's paradigm suggests that Christians do have a profound stake in defending what's under attack. The other thing I would say that's noticeable among those who appropriate Huntington's paradigm is that it contributes to the rhetoric of a struggle between absolute good and absolute evil. It fosters a tendency to see the war on terror as a kind of crusade, a struggle between the true religion, Christianity, and a false one, Islam. Finally, it generates a tendency to believe that there really is nothing we can do, no peacemaking possibilities that exist for reducing the tensions and the conflict. After all, as Huntington says, this is conflict rooted in cultural identities that are immutable. They don't hate us, he says, because of anything we have done, so we can't change what we're doing to reduce conflict. They hate us because of who we are. And of course, if we are Christians, we should not change who we are. Let me offer these final thoughts about Huntington's paradigm, the clash of civilizations. It has been subject to some pretty profound criticism. First thing I think that many folk worry about in relation to Huntington's perspective is that he exaggerates cultural differences. Of course, cultures produce different perspectives. Of course, those different perspectives are often about certain fundamental matters. But it's not as if there is absolute contradiction or absolute disagreement across cultures. I mean, particularly when we think about the relationship between Islamic and Western or Christian culture, there are so many profound similarities between an Islamic worldview and a Christian worldview that Huntington is mistaken to suggest that there is nothing but difference and conflict there. Secondly, many would say that Huntington profoundly exaggerates the inflexibility of cultures. He tends to write as if cultural perspectives, once established, don't change, and that they are unchangeable. But the reality is that cultures do change across time, and in particular, cultures often change as a reaction to their interaction with other cultural perspectives. So cultures overlap and adjust and transform themselves, or at least adapt themselves, often because of their interaction with another cultural perspective from which they borrow or to which they react. Related to all this, and most significant in terms of our concern, is many would say that Huntington's perspective exaggerates the role of Islam in producing conflict with the West. Remember, he says Islamic fundamentalism or a particular perverse form of Islam is not the problem. Islam is the problem. This is the most troubling aspect of his paradigm, and we will see that this continues to be an ongoing source of debate among us. But what those who are troubled by Huntington would insist is that historic, economic, and political factors are much more significant in terms of producing conflict than Islam per se. Now, surely those who have attacked the United States and the West appeal to Islam as a part of their motivation. But many folk would argue that Islam is being used, as any religious tradition could be used, to justify conflict and violence when there are tensions in the historic, economic, and political realities that produce anger and resentment. So again, the problem here with Huntington seems to be that he exaggerates the place of Islam and then underestimates the importance of economic and political factors to the tension between the Islamic world and the West. Well, we will look at two additional paradigms, Jihad versus McWorld and resistance to American empire, which have a very different perspective and do tend to focus on those economic and political realities rather than religion per se. But that's in our next presentation.